Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today is Tuomas Tuure, Advocacy Coordinator of Abilis Foundation in Finland. So the foundation supports people with disabilities to implement their own projects in developing countries. He attended a seminar on the rights of persons with disabilities here in Armenia. Welcome, Mr. Tuure.
Thank you.
So you were the moderator of this talk.
Yeah.
What was the main goal, or the goal in general, of this seminar?
Well, we are actually on a tour together with the roving ambassador from Finland. So one of the goals of the foundation, so in Abilis, well, Abilis works globally. We have worked in over 80 countries. So aside from this global work, one of the key issues of Abilis is how to bring good practices to life, because if we have good practices on disability and we have this wide experience in many countries, then let's import these good practices to new countries. I personally worked in different places around the world, but I've never personally worked in Caucasus before, but my organization Abilis has funded projects in Armenia, for example. But due to current political development, the situation has been that most of the development money is currently targeted in the world towards even the most marginalized countries, so it usually goes, lots of it goes to Africa, for example. So Armenia or its neighboring countries are not really that underdeveloped anymore, and we have wanted to create the kind of cooperation where we focus on more expertise, peer support, good practices, and issues like this. And one of the foundation goals, aside from doing this work, is that since we have the expertise on many different areas of disability and we have many different kinds of disabilities represented in the foundation, we have wanted to, let's give this capacity to all the other actors, because there are lots of international actors and there are lots of stronger actors like our ministry who wants to promote human rights in general. And if you want to promote human rights, it's very logical to have disability really well represented and mainstream. So it's one of the foreign policy areas of Finland that now, in joint cooperation with the ambassador, let's raise issues that are relevant to people with disabilities in this seminar. So one of the seminar was maybe more focused on rehabilitation, one on inclusive education, and today we actually talked more about employment. But when it comes to disability issues, it's important to clarify that you can't really separate these topics, because if the assistive devices are not working, people cannot go to inclusive education. If the inclusive education is not working, then people are not educated and there is no disabled people to employ. And if there is no rehabilitation, people cannot go to their daily work, for example. So in disability, it's a very challenging topic, because all of these multiple factors would have to work at the same time for real inclusive society to operate. And it's very difficult, obviously. I know this is my first time in Armenia. I've been here now for about 24 hours, so I'm not yet a huge expert. I'm not good at pronouncing Armenian names, or I don't know the country that well yet. But I have worked a lot in former Soviet countries. I worked in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia. And the challenges faced by people with disabilities in Caucasus countries, I think, mirror those of other former Soviet, because in the Soviet era, disabled people were not very visible to the society, which means most of the infrastructure is not very accessible. There is a huge lack of education, lack of employment. So it's like very similar kind of topics. And I think our role is more, or the role I'm playing here, is that when we have had good practices in other countries, that okay, this is maybe what we have done, this is what they have done, how to import these good practices to new countries. So this is why we're happy that the ministry is using us. So the trip is the trip is not organized by Abilis, it's organized by our ministry, and then we are the visiting experts on this specific topic. So that's like very brief.
So yes, so you come from Finland,
Yes.
because you noticed, you highlighted the fact that you talked about our ministry, so it's the Ministry of Finland.
Yes.
And in the Finnish law states that a disabled person must not be discriminated against because of his or her disability. A disabled person has a right to live a normal life, for example, to study, work, and start a family. And those are the kind of, this is pretty similar actually to the Armenian law on the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities and their social inclusion in the Republic of Armenia. However, in practice, a similar law may not be or may not result in that in practice. So the inclusion, as you said, you noted that it was about the infrastructure, the urban infrastructure, about so there are things, the visibility of people in the streets, in the public areas, right? So there is little inclusion of those people in Armenia compared to Finland, where I guess there are more there is more inclusive policies, right? So where should Armenia, according, you just spent 24 hours here, but still you were at the seminar during the whole day. So I might think, I might be wrong, but I think you can at least have an idea of where Armenia should start to tackle the issue. And second question related to that, how can an organization like yours also help? You talked about policy, good policies, but in practice, what does that mean? So
yeah. Well, I would begin with, just because I'm coming from Finland, I mean, Finland is not perfect. Obviously, there are things that are very well in Finland, but we still have, so Finland traditionally has been very good on issues like, it's quite good on social security, it's been quite good on healthcare, assistive devices and rehabilitation. But on education, for example, inclusive education is still quite a new thing in Finland, so we have quite little educated disabled people. And the other struggle that we have is employment, that, for example, in Finland, the employment rate of people with disabilities has traditionally been very low, but because it's a very complicated issue, because obviously there are lots of workplaces that are not accessible, there are not so many disabled people who have education, so there are like multiple factors at the same time, and we have like this low level of employment. But now luckily our new government has now talked a lot about this issue, and there is now, I think that within the last 2 years, the topic of disabled people should work has really risen to public discourse in Finland. But so different countries have different strengths. For example, the United States and Canada have much higher rate of disability employment than Finland, but Finland might be better in providing services. So I think each country has their strengths and their weaknesses at the same time. I think one of the goals of my foundation also has been that we seek to employ and use disabled people themselves. So if you think about the sector where I'm working in this global development of disability issues, there are not that many disabled people themselves doing the work. So, and we really believe in this kind of self-advocacy. We are very ideological, so we think it's important that disabled people themselves both make the decisions and do a lot of the work. So for example, when Abilis gives grants or executes projects, we always require that people with disabilities themselves do the work, and that's this very progressive. It sounded very progressive and radical 20 years ago, and now people are it's becoming more normal. So this just to clarify, and I would say that I was very positively, because I understand how difficult the struggle is. You have the architectural problems, you have the societal problems, you have the obviously the not enough financial resources to make everything right immediately. But Armenia has a good political will, and I met today your minister, who is a wheelchair user. And for example, in Finland, we have never had a minister who is a wheelchair user. Currently, we have no one in the parliament who is a wheelchair user. So this is actually really rare. So I think there is this political will. Also, when I heard about inclusive education, how it's so I think Armenia now has the right policies in place. And maybe the role that we want to play is that there are also international, like Armenia has relations, maybe the World Bank, it could be the World Health Organization. There are lots of international actors who are operating in Armenia. So how could our expertise help them to be inclusive in what they do? So disability would not be separated.
Mm-hmm. All right, and as I said, besides urban infrastructure, we talked about the architecture on medical structure, which is also a problem, and inclusion globally. There is also an issue of judgment and stereotypes from people. This is something more rooted, right? Yeah. Families, for example, in Armenia who have children with disabilities feel shame. There is also a lack of special centers for people with special needs. And your foundation, as you said, support people, empowerment of those of people with disabilities. How, according to you, we can do to change the perception on people with disabilities?
I think we always start with visibility. I completely understand this kind of cultural connotations, and they are different around the world. For example, in Asian countries, and in Arab countries and in African countries. They are always a little bit different depending on the religion or the culture. I think in the former Soviet states, it's lots of it to do with lack of visibility. And then due to the lack of visibility, disabled people were always required someone to help them. They were always the object of someone helping them, couldn't do anything by themselves. So I think our approach, where we seek to make disabled people themselves work, make themselves do the work. And for example, I think in the very developing countries, for example, if Abilis project succeeds in creating livelihoods, so for example, disabled women who have been begging for money, if they can through this project be employed, they can earn their own money. That raises their status in the society, and everyone sees them differently. So I think it's like this very grassroots, but I think it's also a bit to do with visibility, that more and more you see disabled people doing things similarly to others, the more it becomes very normalized. So I think, but the change will take time. And what separates disability a little bit as a topic from other human rights issues is that, for example, if you make a law on gender equality, the law can be implemented the next day. But if you make a law on, for example, accessible building, that will only start from the next buildings, and we're going to build for the next 30 years. So you only see the change after a very long time. So disability advocacy requires much longer like this. You have to look always 30 years forward.
Okay, and also you just said you talked about women, and Abilis also specifically focus on women and children. Why? What makes this part of the population an even more vulnerable group?
Well, we have this kind of cross-cutting themes that we want to help people who are most vulnerable, and there's obviously, whether it's the religious reasons, cultural reasons, also physical reasons, there are discrimination that only affects women. So if disabled people are in vulnerable position in the society, then obviously the disabled women are even more, because they face two different issues at the same time. So it's been more cross-cutting theme, I think, for us, that we want to help and to do good policies, but we also want our policies to have this kind of strong gender aspect. I think it's very lots to do with our equality policy.
And it's worldwide, it's not specific to Armenia.
Yes, absolutely.
And some people, this is the last question, some people might say, specifically in Armenia, which has many problems and issues, some people might say, the country's situation is not very good for anyone, then maybe we can solve that issue one day, but we have more urgent issues right now first. What would you answer to those people?
This is what we hear actually in many countries, but it's not really just related to disability. You could say that to any question, that okay, let's look at this later. For example, if you want democracy, they can say, okay, let's first put the infrastructure in place and think about democracy later. I mean, so you have to develop the society as a whole. What I'm thinking is that in the future, if countries want to develop, it's wise. First of all, it's also economically wise that all members of the society are working and active in their communities and being employed and active members of society. So this means that there shouldn't be any part of society, whether it would be ethnic minority or disability minority, that should be completely maybe in institutions or in their homes or out of the society, because in order to create government revenues, young people to be employed, and to create the so-called future of the society, all members should be contributing. So that's usually one of my. I have many answers to that questions, but that's usually one of the first I say.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Tuure. Thank you for watching, and continue to follow CivilNet.